Hi everybody, and welcome back to this next video in my series about Battle for Antares. In this video I would like to show you some very basics, especially how the camera movement works, so how camera control is done. The game itself consists of two game modes. We have the current game mode, which is for playing the game, and then I have a main menu mode, which is active during when you show the main menu or the game initial screen. This is something, this is one of the better choices I've made, I would say. In the last game which I did, I simply didn't know that you can have multiple modes, so I had a lot of logic or a lot of branches and switching happening depending on whether you are within the main menu. Then you need different kind of camera controls and stuff. So there was a lot of branching and a lot of logic within this one game state that I had. So there was definitely a mistake. This time I made it better. I have these two modes, and they refer to different. Or they use different game states and camera pawns and stuff. So that's how it should be done, I would say. And now within the project settings, first I have defined a couple of inputs. So for moving the camera with the WASD keys, I have defined 4 events. And also I have an axis event listening on the mouse wheel. So when you turn the mouse wheel to establish the zooming itself. And now I have, on the one hand, I have this camera pawn, which is essentially just this one camera. There's nothing else in here, and there's no logic whatsoever. It's just the camera itself, and this camera pawn is defined to be the camera pawn here. Where is it? Player default pawn class there, camera pawn. So this game mode uses this pawn as the default pawn. And now all the logic about camera control itself happens within this camera control, this camera controller. That's the player controller, and essentially it starts here with these camera forward, backward, left and right events. They enter the camera controller here, and I have 4 individual variables: forward, backward, left and right, which I set to run to 1 if the key is pressed, and I set them to 0 if either key is released. This is something you could have technically also done with only 1 variable. So I could have set move forward to -1 if you press the backwards key. But what I wanted to achieve is that these kind of actions cancel each other out. So if you press both keys, I would like to have no movement at all. And that's why I have these individual variables moving forward and backward here. And then I simply subtract them. And if you have only 1 key pressed, that's either 1 or -1. But if you have both keys pressed or none, then this difference is 0. So there will be no movement. So that's pretty much the trick here. And now the actual moving itself happens within this tick function here. Essentially, I'm just passing this delta seconds, the time between frames, to this move camera function. And now there's some logic happening here. The first thing which happens is that I take the camera zoom value, so the axis value from your mouse wheel, and essentially I'm checking whether this is not 0. So if there's an actual zooming requested by the user, then I'm going into this upper branch here where I just accumulate this value scaled by the delta time. So this multiplication here scales everything with this delta seconds. I'm just accumulating the mouse wheel activation into this speed zoom variable. And I'm clamping that to make sure that there's a maximum speed that you can achieve. And I'm setting that to the speed zoom variable. If there's no zooming requested by the user, then essentially I'm doing the opposite. I'm going into this lower branch where I again scale down the zoom by itself with a negative scaling factor. So this will eventually then make sure that this speed zoom converges to 0 again. And now I have the same logic for moving sidewards. Here I take moving right minus moving left, and then essentially I'm checking whether this is 0 And if it's not 0, then I'm accumulating it into the speed sidewards variable. If it is 0, then essentially I'm scaling speed sidewards down to 0 again, gradually. The same logic happens here for moving forward and backwards. So that's just pretty much duplications with different inputs and different accumulating into different variables. Now the next thing which happens is that I need to define the boundaries and also the total speed with which I want the camera to move. If you're zoomed in, then you need a slower camera speed to give you some kind of fine-grained control where you move the camera. If you're zoomed further out, then you can move the camera faster to help the user navigate within the galaxy. So essentially, since the game itself is pretty much happening on a 2D plane, all the stars share the Z coordinate of 0, so they're all happening within the XY plane. Essentially, I can just take the Z coordinate of the camera pawn, and this is an indication for how high or how high above the camera is. So as essentially, I'm just projecting that into some minimum and maximum values, and then based on this camera height, I'm setting the current camera speed between a predefined minimum camera speed and maximum camera speed, and then there is some essentially the x and y coordinates of the movable area are also constrained. I have these I'm not sure where I have them. There are these camera location max and min, so there are these minimum and maximum values for where the camera can move. But if the camera is high above the galaxy, then I'm adding some extra boundaries to that to allow for this, or to compensate for this perspective projection of the camera, so that you can always see all the stars. So here in this branch, essentially, I'm calculating the speed and these extra boundaries, and now it's just about applying everything. So what I do here now is to given the current camera speed, I'm just multiplying that with speed forward and speed sidewards, again scaling with the delta seconds to make sure that everything is adaptive to the game speed. And I'm just moving the camera actor with these along this direction. So that's the sidewards and forwards movement. Now I'm doing the same for the zooming. But whereas here I'm moving the camera in the world coordinate system, world domain, here what I'm doing is I take from the current control pan the actor rotation, and I'm just taking the x-axis of that actor. So essentially I'm taking the forward axis of the camera, and the camera is tilted 45 degrees down. So this axis is essentially pointing 45 degrees down. So now I'm taking this axis and again scaling it with the camera speed, the speed zoom, and the delta seconds to give me the direction in which I need to move the camera for zooming. And now I just apply that again to the camera to actually make the camera move forward within its camera local coordinate system. And now the last thing which remains to do is to constrain the camera again to make sure that it stays within the boundaries that I allow, so that the user cannot move it around arbitrarily. So here I have this camera location min and camera location max. I'm breaking that into the individual X, Y, and Z components. And now essentially I'm just clamping them individually and now I'm just taking the camera pawn location and clamping that to these min and max locations. But before that, I'm adding these extra X and Y values to essentially make this volume, this pyramid shaped volume. And now essentially when I have these results ready, I'm setting the camera actor location a third time. And this is pretty much it. So that's pretty much how the camera movement works. You start by these input actions here, have these 4 variables setting to either 1 or 0, depending on whether the user is requesting that actual movement. Then over here I am accumulating the difference between right and left into this speed sidewards variable, which is positively accumulating, so it's increasing when you have either action requested or it's going slowly down to 0 again if you have no action requested. The speed sidewards or speed forward is then multiplied by the actual camera speed to make the actual movement. And finally, everything is constrained. The movement, the speed, camera speed itself, and these kind of extra boundaries depend on camera height. So that in total makes this whole movement logic. Okay, so that's it for now. Thank you very much for listening. If there's something else which interests you, or something is unclear, if you want to learn more details, let me know in the comments. Then I'm sure I can focus on these topics as well. But for now, thank you very much for listening, and see you next time.